तो क्या कहते हैं, टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड चल रहा था, और टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड के डिटोरिएशन का रीजन हम कर चुके थे। रिमेम्बर, हमें डिस्कस किया था कि टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड क्या है। टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड इज बेसिकली your index of export prices over the index of average import prices, and it shows the value of a country's average export prices relative to their import prices. फिर हमने ये भी देखा था कि टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड की सिग्निफिकेंस क्या है, व्हाट डज इट एक्चुअली टेल्स अस। It tells us, the quantity of exports that you need to sell in order to produce a given level of imports. That is the main line. That's what the TOT tells us. फिर हमने कहा TOT improve कब होता है और TOT deteriorate कब होता है। तो अभी हम पढ़ रहे हैं TOT आपका deteriorate कब होता है। TOT बेटा deteriorate होता है जब आपके TOT की वैल्यू फॉल हो जाती है। इसका क्या मतलब है? When the TOT value falls, it implies that the price of a given basket of a nation of exports, given basket of a nation's exports can basically buy less imports than before. In other words, इसका मतलब है कि a given amount of exports, तो a given basket of nation exports बोलो या a given basket of the nation's export prices भी बोलो, एक ही मतलब है, उसका मतलब सेम निकल रहा है कि a basket of export prices, the basket of average export price can buy less imports now, or it means that a given amount of exports can buy fewer imports this year than before. तो अगर आपके टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड डिटोरिएट होते हैं बेसिकली, तो उसकी implication ये है कि since now your export price can buy, or your exports can buy less imports, so basically developing countries or any nation needs to sort of sell more exports in order to buy the same level of imports. So अब हमें ज़्यादा export करना पड़ेगा। So export ज़्यादा करना पड़ेगा भी एक challenge है. It's a challenge. Maybe we don't have the resources to produce the given amount of resource. I mean, we don't have the resources to maybe produce a certain capacity of exports. Maybe we have already exhausted the existing export capacity that we have. Maybe we don't have the resources at the moment to, finance the nation does not have the amount of resources to finance the expansion of export industry, right? Maybe the export industry is already fully employed. Maybe we don't have the right amount of, maybe we have a labor shortage at the moment. Maybe the supply of exports at this point is inelastic, and we cannot sort of increase the export output beyond a certain quantity at the moment, right? So it poses a lot of challenges for policymakers, that if the TOT sort of deteriorates and worsens, whether they will be able to increase. So it means that now you need to export more to buy the same level of imports. But ये तो ठीक है, समझ आ गया, but क्या हमारे पास ये साख्त है? क्या do we have the potential to sort of increase the exports now? Can we do that, or can we not do that? That is again a question, big question mark for a lot of nations, right? So डिटोरिएट कब होते हैं? टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड डिटोरिएट होते हैं जब आपकी इंपोर्ट प्राइसेस जो होती हैं, दे राइज while export prices stay the same. Number one, so your denominator goes up while the numerator is the same, or your export prices fall while import prices stay the same. That is, your numerator goes down, or your export prices and import prices both rise. दोनों rise हो रहे हैं, but the increase in import prices is relatively stronger or more greater than the increase in export prices, and hence your terms of trade sort of falls. So, like I said, implication यही है कि now when the TOT worsens, basically country needs to sell more exports in order to keep the imports at the same level, right? In order to maintain your imports, keep them at the same level, now the country would sort of need to export more now. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge for countries. Whether they will be able to do it or not depends upon a lot of factors. What sort of an export, what sort of commodities you are exporting. I mean, what are you basically exporting? It also depends upon whether, do you have the market for that product in other nations as well? So maybe if you're exporting to, let's say, country A, B, and C, and now you realize, oh, now shit, my terms of trade have worsened, I need to export more to buy the same level of imports. So maybe, target country D, E, and F as well. But do countries D, E, and F want your product? Do we have a market in those countries for your product? Will they buy from you? Maybe they are importing from another country, and they will not import for you, maybe because they find it relatively more competitive to import from them than to you. So will you be able to export more is another challenge and a big question mark for a lot of countries, right? Basically, you can say reason. So ये तो आपके हो गए why terms of trade basically deteriorates. Improve कब होता है terms of trade? आपके improve होते हैं जब आपकी export prices rise हो रही होती हैं while import prices stay constant. That is your numerator basically goes up. Another reason could be import prices fall while export prices stay the same, or it could be that export and import prices both are rising while your export prices are rising relatively more. So maybe your numerator goes down. If your numerator goes down, so obviously the value will increase, the terms of trade value will go up. Or maybe export and import prices both are rising, but export prices are rising relatively greater, right? So ये हमने कल भी cover कर लिया था. अब हम क्या कर रहे हैं? अब हम basically पढ़ रहे हैं what are the basically the reasons for an improvement in terms of trade. Reasons for an improvement in terms of trade. So terms of trade improve कब हो सकता है? Number one, सबसे पहला reason है a strong exchange rate. ठीक है, a strong exchange rate could improve a country's terms of trade. So terms of trade जब improve होता है, इसका मतलब है कि a given basket of exports or a given basket of average export price can buy more imports now, right? The same given basket of average export price or the same basket of exports can end up buying more imports now. That is why we say that your terms of trade have gone up. But why does it goes up? So reason number one could be a strong exchange rate, maybe, right? Now, a strong exchange rate is basically a short-term factor for an improvement in terms of trade. Because अगर exchange rate तुम्हारा आज strong है, तो कल weak भी हो सकता है. तो ये कोई consistent factor नहीं है, कोई long-term factor नहीं है terms of trade जिसकी वजह से improve होता है. It's a short-term factor, temporary factor. अगर आज terms of trade एक strong exchange rate की वजह से improve हो रहे हैं, तो कल को एक weak exchange rate की वजह से वो worsen भी हो सकता है, right? So it's a short-term factor. It will fluctuate. So a strong exchange rate could happen maybe because the demand for the currency is going up. So maybe the demand for the currency is going up. And if the demand for the currency due to any reason is going up, maybe there are more hot money inflows into the country, or maybe there's more FDI into the country, or maybe you're exporting more. So for whatever reason, the demand for the currency is going up. And when the demand for the currency increases, maybe because the nation is exporting more, or there is more FDI, or there's more hot money inflows, and the demand for the currency goes up. Let's say that your currency is rupees, so the demand for rupees goes up. And what happens is that if demand for rupees goes up, rupee becomes stronger. So rupee becomes stronger against the dollar, and what happens is that rupee appreciates. So rupees become stronger. And what the implication for Pakistan is that as a consequence, what's going to happen is that the price of imports would decrease, while subsequently the price of exports would go up. And if the price of imports would go down, while the price of exports would go up, or to combine, this would cause a rise in the terms of trade. अब आपकी अगर रुपी की डिमांड बढ़ रही है और आपकी करेंसी एक्सचेंज रेट आपका स्ट्रॉन्गर हो गया, सो अगर आपका एक्सचेंज रेट स्ट्रॉन्ग हो जाता है, स्ट्रॉन्ग एक्सचेंज रेट, तो हम पढ़ रहे हैं कि स्ट्रॉन्ग एक्सचेंज रेट की वजह से व्हाट इज द इंपैक्ट ऑन इंपोर्ट प्राइस एंड एक्सपोर्ट प्राइस. So we are saying that imports will become cheaper for you now, as in artificially cheaper, while exports will sound more expensive, while imports will seem and sound more cheaper now. So the terms of trade will basically improve. So when your import prices go down and your export prices go up, your terms of trade improves. Because terms of trade hai kya? It is basically the index of your average, export prices over the index of your average import prices. So what's going to happen is that when average export prices are rising and average import prices are falling, it will improve your terms of trade position, right? So this could be one reason why the terms of trade position could improve, because of a strong exchange rate, a strong currency. So a strong currency would improve your terms of trade. The second factor that could actually improve your terms of trade is that, so an improvement in terms of trade ka dekho matlab kya hai, that the same amount of exports could end up buying more imports. So that seems like a good thing. But is it really a good thing? It depends upon what is causing that improvement in terms of trade. Right? Remember this thing very, very carefully, that an improvement in terms of trade means that the same basket of exports could end up buying more imports. It sounds like a good thing to you, but what is the reason behind it? So if your terms of trade are going up because of a worsening in international competitiveness. So for example, the second factor why your terms of trade could improve is a worsening of international competitiveness. So this could happen, a worsening of international competitiveness, right? So what's going to happen is that maybe there's an increase in, there's a rise in relative inflation in the country. So if inflation goes up, your goods and services become expensive in the country, and so will your exports become expensive. So the price of exports will go up because of that, and your terms of trade will improve. And although this would seem like a good thing that, now your exports could buy more imports because the average export price has gone up, the index of the average export price has gone up. The index of the average export price has gone up, and this will improve the value of the TOT, and it will seem like a good thing, but in reality, it's not a good thing. Why? Because you're over here, the price of exports have gone up because of inflation in the country, right? And it will actually not be as in on a macroeconomic level, it's not healthy for the country, because it will result into a current account deficit basically. If your exports are becoming uncompetitive, it would worsen the balance of trade position. So although your terms of trade will improve, they are improving, but your balance of trade will deteriorate, right? So so that's one reason. Another reason could be maybe because there is a fall in productivity. So if there's a fall in productivity in the economy, the fall in productivity of labor, a fall in productivity of capital, a fall in productivity of businesses in the economy. So overall, if enterprise productivity falls as well, if labor capital productivity falls, basically your exports will become uncompetitive. There will be a worsening of the international competitiveness of your goods, and that will increase the price of your exports, and that will improve your terms of trade. But again, that's not a good thing for the economy. Another reason is capital depreciation. So if there's a depreciation of capital, definitely, through poor investment, there's poor investment in the economy, and that sort of causes a lot. I mean, we know that capital depreciation because of poor investment in capital goods can actually end up causing problems, structural problems for the industries, and that could ultimately result into a long-term rise in cost of production for firms, right, and the economy, and causing a decline in productivity and efficiency of output. And ultimately, the net impact would be that it will feed through uncompetitiveness of exports, driving the price of exports upwards and causing an improvement in your terms of trade, right? So this is another reason why terms of trade could actually go up. But remember, even if terms of trade are going up, all these factors are indicating one thing, that it's not a good thing for the economy, because this will result into a lot of problems for the economy. Why? Because it will have a negative impact on your balance of trade position in your current account. Your current account might go into a deficit, right? Also, we know that inflation is not good for the economy on its own. Inflation may result into, there will be unemployment as well. So it may result into unemployment in the economy as well. So there are fall in productivity would also result into inflation. Ultimately, it will drive up the cost of production, and it will result into, and it will stagnate the growth in the country. All these reasons will ultimately result into growth stagnation. It will stagnate the growth in the economy, because it will result into supply side issues in the economy. All these factors will basically cause a shift in your short run aggregate supply inwards to the left, right? And because of that, it will drive up the relative price level in the economy, causing cost push inflation, at the same time causing a reduction in your real GDP, as in it will reduce your real GDP, it will stagnate your growth in the economy, right? Negative growth rates आएंगे आपकी economy में. So basically, the third thing that could cause an improvement in your terms of trade is maybe there is, let's say, higher demand for a nation's exports, higher demand for a nation's exports. And what's going to happen is, what's going to happen is, maybe your trading partners, maybe your major trading partners, maybe your major trading partners, जैसे कि मैंने आपसे कल जिक्र किया था, I showed you this slide कि पाकिस्तान के जो मेजर ट्रेडिंग पार्टनर्स है, फ्रॉम द पाकिस्तान ब्यूरो ऑफ स्टैटिस्टिक्स वेबसाइट, आई गॉट दिस, कि पाकिस्तान के मेजर ट्रेडिंग पार्टनर्स इन 2021-2022 वर अमेरिका, चाइना, यूके, राइट? एंड अगर ये आपके मेजर ट्रेडिंग पार्टनर्स है कि एक्सपोर्ट रेवेन्यूज इन पे डिपेंडेंट है, इनको सबसे ज्यादा एक्सपोर्ट का शेयर गया है, तो अगर आपके मेजर ट्रेडिंग पार्टनर्स में बूम आ रहा है, वहां पे इनकम्स बढ़ रही हैं, so they are witnessing higher economic growth, so they will obviously import more from you, and if they import more from you, so you are exporting them more. So ideally what's happening is that demand for Pakistani exports will go up. So if there's a boom or there's growth in China, USA and America and UK, the demand for Pakistani exports will go up. And when demand for Pakistani exports will go up, what's going to happen? When, remember I told you, price follows demand. If demand goes up, the price goes up. The price of Pakistani exports will go up, which will cause an improvement in your terms of trade. So your terms of trade will improve, the value of the terms of trade will go up. So what you need to know is that as a consequence, your export prices will rise relative to import prices, because of an increase in incomes and economic growth in economies that are your major trading partners. There's a boom over there. So demand for your exports go up, the price of exports go up, and so does your terms of trade, basically, right? तो ये आपके रीजंस हैं कि टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड आपके इंप्रूव क्यों होते हैं. अब आपने जो कल पास्ट पेपर क्वेश्चन किया था, दैट वाज फोकस्ड ऑन why would terms of trade deteriorate? For example, ये जो question है कि terms of trade आपके deteriorate क्यों होंगे? Explain 3 causes of the fall in the China's terms of trade. यही सवाल आता है, explain 3 causes of a rise in the terms of trade. तो rise in the terms of trade के जो मैंने अभी आपको causes बताए हैं, यही causes आपको लिख कर आने होंगे एग्जाम में, जो मैंने आपको बताए हैं उतनी ही डिटेल में जितने मैंने आपको बताए, प्रॉपर एनालिसिस के साथ. अब एक और सवाल आपके पास बनता है, एग्जाम में अक्सर आता है ये, कि what are the implications and impacts, what are the implications and impacts of a fall in terms of trade? Fall in terms of trade means if the terms of trade basically worsens or it sort of deteriorates. So what is the impact? Now, when could terms of trade basically deteriorate and when could it worsen? It could worsen when the price of exports basically go down. It could worsen when the price of imports go up, or it could worsen if, you know, sort of your price of exports and imports both go down, but export price goes down relatively higher. ये तीन reasons हम पढ़ चुके हैं यहाँ पे कि why does the terms of trade worsens. It worsens because of these three reasons. Export prices and import prices both are rising, but you know, or maybe your export and import prices both are falling. Maybe the export prices is falling and import prices both are falling. ये भी fall हो रहा है, ये भी fall हो रहा है, लेकिन export prices are falling by a relatively greater amount. Or maybe export prices and import prices both are rising. दोनों rise हो रहे हैं, export prices भी rise हो रही हैं, import prices भी rise हो रही हैं, लेकिन import prices जो है वो ज्यादा से rise हो रही है. Right? So if export prices and import prices both are rising, but import prices are rising by a relatively higher amount, the terms of trade will worsen. Or export prices and import prices both are falling, but export prices are falling by a greater amount. Again, terms of trade will worsen. ठीक है? तो इस थर्ड सिनेरियो के दो और सिनेरियोस बन सकते हैं. क्लियर? सो ये बात हो गई. ठीक है, सो क्या इंपैक्ट आ सकता है, जरा सोच के बताओ टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड के ऊपर. मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक इंपैक्ट क्या आ सकता है कंट्री के ग्रोथ पे, उनकी एक्सपोर्ट्स पे? व्हाट आर द इंपैक्ट्स दैट अ वर्सनिंग ऑफ टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड कुड हैव फॉर एन इकोनॉमी? ये देखें, लेट्स सपोज इफ द टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड, आप अज्यूम करें कि द टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड आर फॉलिंग because of a fall in the price of exports. So if your export prices are falling and that is causing a fall in the terms of trade, देखो जब तुम terms of trade की implications बताओगे ना, तुम्हें देखना पड़ेगा कि तुम किस country की बात कर रहे हो. Especially you need to mention about developing countries, because for developing countries it will make matters worse. Why? I'll tell you. So let's suppose you're talking about a developing country that is dependent on primary commodities, that is dependent on the export of a developing country, or a poor country that is dependent on the export of overly dependent on the export of primary commodities. Now, what happens is that the export of primary commodities पे dependent है, and the price of exports go down. So ideally होना क्या चाहिए? हमने पढ़ा है कि when the price of exports go down, the quantity of exports go up, and that causes an increase in export revenues. ये पढ़ा है कि नहीं पढ़ा है हमने? क्या ये कंडीशन पड़ी है जिसकी वजह से हमारा बैलेंस ऑफ ट्रेड इंप्रूव हो जाता है? लेकिन आपको ये मैंने कल की क्लास में भी बताया था कि ये कंडीशन जो है एक सर्टेन, यानी ये होने के लिए एक सर्टेन चीज का होना बहुत जरूरी है. इसकी कंडीशन क्या है? इसकी कंडीशन है कि द प्राइस पीडी फॉर एक्सपोर्ट शुड बी ग्रेटर देन 1. अगर पीडी फॉर एक्सपोर्ट्स ग्रेटर देन 1 है, तभी जाके एक्सपोर्ट रेवेन्यूज आपके बढ़ेंगे. अगर आपकी पीडी फॉर एक्सपोर्ट्स ग्रेटर देन 1 नहीं है, तो एक्सपोर्ट रेवेन्यूज नहीं बढ़ेंगे. बल्कि क्या होगा कि अगर आपकी प्राइस ऑफ एक्सपोर्ट्स गिर जाती हैं, ठीक है, तो क्वांटिटी डिमांडेड जो है फॉर एक्सपोर्ट्स, द क्वांटिटी डिमांडेड फॉर एक्सपोर्ट्स, और दैट इज द क्वांटिटी ऑफ एक्सपोर्ट्स will, if the price of exports go down, the quantity of exports will rise, but by a very small proportion, and as a result your export revenues, instead of rising, they will fall. Right? ये कब होगा बेटा? ये होगा अगर आपकी PED for exports inelastic है, if the PED for exports is less than 1. So exports should be, remember that if your exports are price inelastic, and the price of exports go down, right? So let's say if the price of exports go down by 10%, if the price of exports go down by 10%, but the quantity of exports only rise by how much? They only rise by, let's say, 2%, then your export revenues will fall, because the price effect will overpower or offset the quantity effect. So what's going to happen is that overall your export revenues will go down, and it will worsen your balance of trade position. It's going to worsen your current account deficit. So why is this important for developing countries? Because developing countries jo hote hain, they are poor countries. They are dependent on primary commodity exports. So these are poor countries. They have a comparative advantage in agricultural goods and mining and fishing, and they're exporting primary commodities. And what happens is that we know that demand for primary commodities, that is the PD for primary commodities, is less than 1. तो प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज की जो डिमांड है वो प्राइस इनइलास्टिक है. हमें पता है कि प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज जो है वो प्राइस इनइलास्टिक होती हैं, चाहे वो डोमेस्टिकली सेल हो रही हो या वो प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज एक्सपोर्ट हो रही हो. For the domestic economy, the demand is inelastic. For the rest of the world, it is inelastic as well. Which means that if you're exporting primary commodities, the PD for exports would be less than 1. It would be inelastic if you are exporting primary commodities. So the PD for exports would be, if you're exporting primary commodities, it would be inelastic, price inelastic. And what happens is that, let's say if the price of your exports fall, it will cause a deterioration in your terms of trade. So your terms of trade will deteriorate. So what's going to happen is that the price of exports will go down, and the price of exports could go down for any reason. और वो क्या रीजन है कि भाई एक्सपोर्ट प्राइसेस क्यों गिर सकती हैं, हम पढ़ चुके हैं. जैसे कि हो सकता है कि आपकी एक कंट्री में इन्फ्लेशन गिर गई हो, maybe there's a rise in productivity, maybe there's a technological advancement, maybe there's a fall in inflation. So all of these factors will basically reduce the price of your sort of exports. And what's going to happen is that your terms of trade will deteriorate, right? But this is really, really harmful for developing economies, especially. Why is it harmful for developing economies? Because developing economies are dependent on the export of primary commodities, जिसकी जो demand होती है बेटा वो price inelastic होती है. तो होता क्या है कि जब export prices गिर जाती हैं, so assumption होनी चाहिए थी कि भाई export prices गिर जाएंगी और quantity of exports बढ़ जाएगी, तो ठीक है, मान लेते हैं कि terms of trade deteriorate हो रहा है, but this is actually a good thing for the economy because your balance of trade will improve and your current account deficits will fall. But this is a major assumption that we are making. If the reality is that these export of primary commodities is price inelastic, so the quantity of exports will rise, but very much insignificantly. That is going to cause an overall decline in your export revenues. So your export revenues will basically fall. Your export revenues will go down. That is the value of your X, the value of your exports will go down. Now we know that export is basically a component of your aggregate demand. So if export revenues goes down, your aggregate demand goes down because exports is a component in the AD equation. So if your exports go down, your aggregate demand goes down. And when aggregate demand goes down, it basically slows down the economy. It stagnates the economy. It slows down the economy. It causes a deflationary impact, a recessionary impact. So what's going to happen is that economic growth will fall in developing economies, which will reduce the incomes and living standards in developing countries, which will reduce the real GDP in developing countries, which will reduce the GNI in developing countries, which will reduce the real GDP per capita in developing countries. It will even reduce the GNI per capita in developing countries. So that is a very bad implication for a deterioration of terms of trade. Number one, for developing economies. Number two, if those developing economies, which they are pretty much dependent on the export of primary commodities. If in that case, even though domestic inflation is falling, even though the cost of living crisis in those developing countries is getting better, even though industries are being efficient, but that could cause a fall in the price of exports. And if that happens, because what happens is that if industry cost is going down, it feeds through the price of exports. Ultimately, वो जो burden, वो जो exports की cost गिर रही है, they're getting competitive, उसका जो benefit है वो consumers तक पहुंचेगा, international consumers को भी translate होगा, they will also get that benefit. But what impact will that do is that since export of primary commodities on which these developing nations are dependent on, since they are price inelastic, it will cause an overall decline in the export revenues, causing a decline in aggregate demand, causing a worsening of the current account deficit, and also stagnating growth, reducing growth, suppressing growth, depressing growth, etc. etc. So ये आपकी पहली implication हो जाएगी. अगर आप ये अच्छे से लिख पाते हो एग्जाम के अंदर, so definitely it will become a very solid analysis. ठीक है? Second thing that you can actually write is, तो developing countries का link आप जरूर देंगे. The second thing that actually you can write is, in the exam is that you could say that जब आपके terms of trade basically deteriorate होते हैं, so what does it mean? It means that the same basket of exports cannot, your basket of exports cannot buy the same imports. That is your export price. Your average export price cannot buy the same level of imports. So in order to buy the same level of imports, you need to export more now. मैं repeat कर देता हूँ. When terms of trade deteriorate, it simply means that the same basket of exports cannot buy, it means that a given basket of exports cannot buy the same level of imports. So if you want to buy the same level of imports, you need to export more now. So you need to export more. And the problem is कि मसला ये है, तो फिर एक सवाल होना चाहिए आपका, भाई नहीं करते ना हम वो import, उतनी imports buy नहीं करते, भाई नहीं करते imports buy. If a given basket of exports can no longer buy the same level of imports, to hell with the imports. Let's not import. Let's import less. But there is a problem here. The problem is that developing countries, the poor countries, they are again dependent on the import of capital goods. They are dependent on the import of manufactured goods. They are dependent on the import of essential raw materials, such essential chemicals for the import of, for manufacturing in their domestic industries. They don't have the comparative advantage in producing manufactured goods. They import it from emerging and developed economies. So they need to buy the imports. So the problem is that if terms of trade are deteriorating, it means that the same basket of exports cannot buy the same level of imports. So what is going to happen is that now this means that because it simply means that now you have less incomes and less profits to available, and now you need to spend more money. So basically now more money needs to be spent on the same level of imports, which will harm economic development. क्या मतलब इस बात का? इसका सिंपल मतलब ये है कि अगर मैं कह रहा हूं कि टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड डिटोरिएट हो रहे हैं, इसका मतलब है कि your export cannot buy same level of import, which means that since your export prices have gone down, right, which actually means that now what you need to do is that you need to export more in order to buy the same level of imports. But what it also means is that now, since export prices have gone down, the average export price has gone down, and the same basket of exports cannot buy this same level of imports. Now what you need to do is that which obviously means that now your incomes and profits for exporting firms are lower, and now what this means is that now you need to sort of spend more money. You now need to spend more money on the same level of imports, because मैंने आपसे वही वाली बात बोली कि now what's going to happen is that your export industries might witness a decline in incomes and profits, and now countries' resources, the scarce resources of the country, will be allocated more to export industries than to other domestic production and than to, let's say, other expenditures on education and healthcare. Instead of government's resources being diverted on education and healthcare, maybe the government needs to spend more in sort of supporting the export sector to sort of make them produce more exports so that they can export more to buy the same level of imports. And what will happen as a result of this is that more money will be spent on buying the same level of imports now, because since your exports can buy less imports, so temporarily, in order to fill in that gap, more of the economy's money, more of the nation's money will be spent on buying the same level of imports, which will harm the economic development in the nation, because now there will be less income that will be available to spend on, let's say, life-sustaining goods and services, right? And as a response, what will now developing countries do? Developing countries will be like, yeah, now we were exporting to maybe country A, B, and C, but now since our export prices have fallen, our same exports cannot buy the same imports. So as a response, more of the government's money is being spent on buying the same level of imports. As a result, the economic growth is being harmed and development is being harmed in the economy. So now these developing countries will try to increase the supply of their commodities these developing countries will try to target other markets, maybe country D, E, and F, and country X, Y, and Z as well. They'll be like, yeah, we need to now export more to other countries as well, maybe target other nations as well, export to them. And in order to export to them, they need to produce more. So the domestic production of these primary commodities will go up, because they will be like, we need to export more to other nations so that we can get those revenues, so we can use those revenues to actually buy the same level of imports. Because like I said, when your terms of trade deteriorate, you need to basically your same exports cannot buy the same imports. So you need to export more to buy the same imports. Now, temporarily, the government will be using its funds and incomes to sort of buy the same level of imports, but you can't rely on government's incomes all the time, because it means that less will be spent on life sustaining goods, let's say, on education, healthcare, public goods, right, and parks, etc. So as a result, to fill in that gap, the developing countries, the export industry would start producing more primary commodities, so that it could target other nations. And as the supply of the domestic primary commodities goes up, so price of the primary commodities will go down further. Because supply of primary commodities जब बढ़ेगी, so price of primary commodities और गिर जाएगी, which means कि price of exports मजीद गिर जाएगी, which will push the commodity prices even more. तो जैसे हम ज्यादा सप्लाई करने की, ज्यादा प्रोड्यूस करने की कोशिश करेंगे ताकि हम ज्यादा एक्सपोर्ट कर सकें, इस चक्कर में कि हम और क्वांटिटी एक्सपोर्ट करके थोड़े और रेवेन्यूज कमा लें, सो दैट आवर रेवेन्यूज कुड बाय द सेम इंपोर्ट्स. इसी चक्कर में होगा ये कि प्राइस ऑफ एक्सपोर्ट्स मजीद गिर जाएगी, which will worsen the problem. So we will be stuck into this cycle. Basically, it will worsen the terms of trade further, and we will still be stuck into that cycle. It's not a solution. This is a problem that developing countries suffer from. Basically, they can suffer from potentially. ठीक है? The third thing that you could mention is कि अगर terms of trade fall करते हैं, if the terms of trade falls or the terms of trade deteriorate, it could significantly worsen the government's budget position. You could write it will significantly worsen the government's budget position. How will it worsen the government budget position? It will worsen the budget position because let's say that if the export prices go down, if the export prices go down and the PED for exports is inelastic, it is less than 1. So इससे क्या होगा? इससे आपकी quantity of exports will go up, but significantly less. But it will go up significantly less. And as a result, the export revenues will go down. Now, if the export revenues goes down, the export revenue से government भी तो tax generate करती है, because export revenue से government tax generate करती है. Government collects corporate tax from these exporting firms. These exporting firms are paying incomes to its employees, so the government generates income taxes. The government collects VAT as well. Sales tax se revenue generate hota hai, because exports is basically a component of AD, and AD results into economic growth. Economic growth results into rise in national incomes. So if economic growth slows down, economic growth decreases, your income taxes will go down, your corporate taxes will go down, and your sales tax revenues will go down. Expenditure taxes like VAT will go down as well, as because your economy is slowing down. Economy is slowing down because of a decline in AD, and your AD is declining because of a fall in export revenues. So as a consequence, what will happen is that the tax revenues will go down. And mention karna ke sare tax revenue, corporate income, VAT, expenditure taxes such as VAT. So aapke tax revenues will decline. Jab aapke tax revenue decline karega, it will mean that the government will have less revenue to spend on education, healthcare, infrastructure. And education, healthcare, infrastructure, these are very important. These are all crucial for the the long run performance and the growth of an economy. So investing in healthcare, education, infrastructure is so important for the long run growth, for the long run performance and the growth of an economy. And if the government cuts its expenditures from these avenues, it will decline the long run growth performance of an economy, right? So ultimately, if tax revenue गिरेगा, तो government जो है वो budget deficit में जा सकती है. और आपको पता है कि budget deficit में अगर government गई, तो उसको finance करने के लिए, budget deficit को finance करने के लिए, because what is a budget deficit? Budget deficit is when the government expenditure, the tax revenue, the government's expenditure is more than tax revenues, right? So if the amount of government spending is more than the amount of revenue generated from taxes, how will the government finance its expenditures? It will ultimately borrow, and borrowing It could either borrow domestically or it could borrow internationally as well. But in either case, whether it borrows domestically or it borrows internationally, it will result into, it will increase the government's national debt. It will increase the debt of the country. So अगर government जो है वो budget deficit में जाती है because of a decline in tax revenues, तो government को फिर borrow करना पड़ता है, क्योंकि government expenditure को कम करना is not ideal, right? Because a lot of people are relying on those government expenditures. Government expenditures में बहुत चीजें आ रही होती हैं, right? You have welfare payments, you have spending on essential public services like infrastructure, education, healthcare. Subsidies भी आ रही होती हैं, government spending on subsidies भी आ रही होती हैं. So ये तमाम की तमाम government spending को फाइनेंस करने के लिए टैक्स रेवेन्यूज होने चाहिए. और अगर टैक्स कलेक्शन नहीं हो रही है तो बजट डेफिसिट में हम जाते हैं और उसको फाइनेंस करने के लिए हमें बोरोइंग करनी पड़ती है, जिससे डेट बढ़ता है. सो ये अगेन एक इम्प्लीकेशन है. एंड डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज आर ऑलरेडी रनिंग ऑन, we know that developing countries are already running on current account deficits, and developing countries, since they are running on current account deficits, they are not even able to attract financial account surpluses as well to offset that. हमें पता ही, हम पीछे BOP में पढ़ के आ रहे हैं कि developing countries, poor nations are already suffering from availability of finances to finance the current account deficit. They're not able to attract the right amount of FDI and inflows, and ultimately they have to resort to borrowing. Also, they don't have enough foreign exchange reserves that they can use domestically to finance the current account deficits, and to use that money, use those foreign exchange reserves to sort of adjust the financial account and offset the current account deficit. So ultimately they have to go to organizations like IMF and World Bank, and again that increases further debt, right? So already developing countries are on high levels of debt, and if they don't have the money to spend domestically on their own domestic expenditures, because not enough tax revenue is generated, it will just increase further debt, because maybe the government then needs to borrow from the domestic firms by issuing them bonds, right? The government for this case में bonds issue करती है, domestic firms को bonds issue करती है, so that they can borrow from the private sector of an economy to finance the government spending of an economy, right? जिसकी वजह से crowding out effect भी आता है, ये हम पढ़ेंगे fiscal policy के अंदर. तो क्या कहते हैं, ये सारी आपकी पॉलिसी implications हैं. I mean, ये सारी आपकी implications हैं of terms of trade worsening. Last एक देख लो तो तुम लिख कर आ सकते हो, वो ये है कि जैसे कि मैंने ये बात की, बजट डेफिसिट के साथ साथ गवर्नमेंट का डेट भी बढ़ेगा. खैर डेट का पॉइंट इधर भी कवर हो रहा था. डेवलपिंग नेशन पे बात करना, डेवलपिंग नेशन का टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड अगर वर्सन हो रहा है, if the terms of trade for a developing nation is worsening, it is likely to experience, लिख कर आना, it is likely, ये होगा, उनको एक्सपीरियंस होगा. likely to experience what? They are likely to experience higher levels of indebtedness. They will experience, देखो, the debt for developing nations will increase. एक ये तरीका है लिखने का. But if you want to make it sound like an adjective, as in you want to make it sound like a feeling to them, so they will experience that feeling of high levels of indebtedness. They will feel indebted. Why? उनका debt बढ़ जाएगा. How will the debt go up? Because the point is that if the terms of trade is going down, because if the price of exports are falling, it means that developing nations, आपको पता है कि developing nations की जो exports होती हैं वो price inelastic होती हैं, क्योंकि उनकी जो major export होती है वो primary commodities ही होती है, ठीक है, जिसकी demand जो होती है वो price inelastic होती है. So if the price of exports are going down for developing economies, this is a bad sign. Why? Because it will result into a fall in export revenues, right? So if export revenues are falling, it will result, because if export revenues are falling, it will make it harder for developing countries to service their existing debt. Because देखो, export जब हम करते हैं ना, जब हम export करते हैं तो export से foreign exchange generate होता है. उसी foreign exchange reserves को हम use करते हैं अपने existing debt को service करने के लिए, pay back करने के लिए. तो जब आपके export revenues decline होंगे, so will the foreign currency that is coming in. Because exports को आप finance, export revenues को ही तो आप use करते हो to finance your exports. Export revenues result in foreign currency reserves, which are used to service the debt. So export revenues will fall. It will make it harder to service the existing debt. So export revenues are falling, guys. If export revenues are falling, it will make it harder to service existing debt. To reduce debt लिख के नहीं आना, to service the debt. Service the debt करने का मतलब है to pay back to its creditors. pay back, because you are a debtor, right? आपके पास कर्जे हैं, आपने वो कर्जे वापस करने हैं. कर्जे वापस करने के लिए एक्सपोर्ट रेवेन्यू आना चाहिए ताकि फॉरेन करेंसी रिजर्व्स आए. उन रिजर्व्स को आप यूज करेंगे टू पे बैक, टू सर्विस योर डेट. सर्विस योर डेट का वर्ड यूज होगा, ठीक है. सो एक्सट्रीम केसेस में क्या होता है कि जब कंट्रीज को डिफिकल्टी होना शुरू हो जाती है टू सर्विस देयर डेट, इन एक्सट्रीम केसेस this then leads to countries having to further borrow more from other countries to service their existing debt. यानी एक कंट्री का लोन उतारने के लिए दूसरे कंट्री से बोरो करना पड़ा, तो आप डेट ट्रैप में फंसते चले जाते हो. तो होता ही है कि this leads to countries having to increase and to borrow further in order to repay their debt, and this increases the level of their indebtedness. Basically they are now more indebted or they are not only indebted more, they're also borrowing from other countries because they don't have the money to purchase the necessary import of capital goods, let's say, because all your foreign currency reserves were, let's say, used to service your existing debt, and now you don't have the foreign currency reserves left enough to import. So how will you import capital goods now? So ultimately you will borrow more. You'll borrow more to service your existing debt. You'll also borrow more to import more, because you need to import capital goods, you need to import oil, etc., etc. And for that you need money, right? So it will just worsen your international position. It will make things worse for your current account as well. So more of the money that you borrow, देखो अगर आप पैसा borrow कर रहे हो ना किसी country से, let's suppose Saudi Arabia has given you some money, or maybe IMF has given you some money, you need to use that money to invest in projects, long-term projects that will generate returns and profits and incomes for you. If you are using that money just to buy imports, or you are using that money to repay other countries, then what's the point? So more of the money is being diverted into debt repayment, and not only debt repayment, these debts come with high interest. So this money is diverted into debt repayment and into the debt interest repayment as well, right? Instead of promoting growth and development, you were supposed to use this money to promote growth and to promote development, but you are using this money to repay the debt and to repay the interest on that debt, right? And remember that, like I said, sometimes what happens, especially developing countries who only have a comparative advantage in primary commodities, they are like, okay, fine, you know what, we will now sort of export more primary commodities. And let's say that if the demand for primary and if what happens is that they're like, okay, let's do one thing, we don't have enough money to repay the debtors, repay our loans and repay the debt, and we don't have enough money to buy imports, and we have taken loans from different countries, let's export more this year. So they will be like, chalo yaar, is saal ek kaam karte hain, is fiscal year mein na, let's target more exports, let's expand the exporting industries. And as a consequence, if the economy increases the quantity of its exports, it will drive the export prices down, because what it will do is that they were like, let's do one thing, let's export to country X, Y, and Z as well. In order to export to country X, Y, Z, they need to produce more exports. And if they produce more exports, the supply of exports go up, the supply of primary commodities go up, and the price of primary commodities go down. If the price of primary commodities go down, we know that primary commodities are price inelastic. They are less than one. And it will just worsen the issue. और export revenues कम हो जाएंगे. Export revenues बढ़ने के बजाय और कम हो जाएंगे. Because आप अपने loans, तभी तो हम कहते हैं developing countries always remain poor. It's difficult for developing countries to come out of poverty unless and until they set up industries and invest in long-term productive projects. If अगर वो debt लेकर debt को repay करने में लगे रहेंगे, तो कभी भी वो poverty trap से ना वो poverty trap से निकलेंगे, ना वो debt trap से निकलेंगे. फंसे रहेंगे poverty trap के vicious circle में और debt trap के vicious circle में. अभी आप देख लें, पेमेंट करनी है ना हमको अपने डेट उसको अपने डेट्स की, तो डेट्स को रीपे करने के लिए अगर हम ये सोच रहे हैं और एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं, अब प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज की ही कंपैरेटिव एडवांटेज है हमारे पास, तो वी आर लाइक चलो लेट्स एक्सपोर्ट टू कंट्री एक्स वाई जी, एंड फॉर दैट लेट्स प्रोड्यूस मोर. And if you start producing more, the price of exports of primary commodities goes down further, which just worsens the issue. The issue keeps on repeating itself. In fact, it keeps on repeating itself, manifesting itself much worse with time. So that's it. That's the problem. And it just makes the developing countries stick to poverty and stick to the level of indebtedness. तो ये टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड का चैप्टर बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है विद रिगार्ड टू डेवलपिंग नेशंस, बिकॉज टर्म्स ऑफ डेवलपिंग नेशंस क्यों कैलकुलेट करते हैं अपने टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड? वो इसलिए कैलकुलेट करते हैं ताकि वो ये देख सके कि उनके टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड डिटोरिएट तो नहीं हो रहे, और अगर उनको ये भनक पड़ गई कि भाई टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड डिटोरिएट हो रहे हैं, तो उनको ये बात पता होती है कि हमारी जो कि अगर हमारे टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड डिटोरिएट हो गए तो ये हमारे लिए बहुत बड़ी प्रॉब्लम आ सकती है, क्योंकि हम एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज। तो फिर उससे उनको सीखना क्या चाहिए? उससे उनको ये सीखना चाहिए दे शुड प्रॉब्ली डेवलप एंड सेट अप अदर इंडस्ट्रीज, कि प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज पे रिलाय ना करें, क्योंकि अगर आपके टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड डिटोरिएट हुए और आप सिर्फ प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज पे रिलायंट हैं, तो और आपने प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज को बेस बनाकर आपने कहा कि चलो यार प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज को बेस बनाते हैं, उनको एक्सपोर्ट करेंगे, तो उनको एक्सपोर्ट करने के चक्कर में तो आपके एक्सपोर्ट रेवेन्यूज और कम हो जाएंगे। एक्सपोर्ट रेवेन्यूज कम हो जाएंगे तो बैलेंस ऑफ ट्रेड पोजीशन वर्सन होगी, करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट बढ़ेगा। करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट बढ़ेगा तो उसको तो आप फाइनेंस कर नहीं पाएंगे, एफडीआई अट्रैक्ट करके, हॉट मनी से अट्रैक्ट करके, तो फाइनेंशियल अकाउंट से सेट ऑफ तो कर नहीं पाएंगे, अल्टीमेटली बोरो करना पड़ जाएगा आईएमएफ से, क्योंकि आपके पास रिजर्व ही नहीं होंगे इतने एग्जिस्टिंग कि आप उससे सेट ऑफ करें, तो रिजर्व से भी नहीं कर पाएंगे, चले जाएंगे आईएमएफ के पास। आईएमएफ के पास जाएंगे, उनसे लोन ले लेंगे, उनसे लोन लेंगे, उसको रीपे करने के लिए आप बोलेंगे अच्छा चलो भाई लोन रीपे करने हैं, लोन रीपे करने के लिए डॉलर चाहिए, और डॉलर के लिए एक्सपोर्ट करो, और एक्सपोर्ट भी क्या करो? प्राइमरी कमोडिटी एक्सपोर्ट करो। चलो भाई प्राइमरी कमोडिटी एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं, प्राइमरी कमोडिटी एक्सपोर्ट करने के लिए प्रोड्यूस करो, प्राइमरी कमोडिटी प्रोड्यूस करने गए तो प्राइसेस गिर गई, उसकी सप्लाई बढ़ गई, प्राइस गिर गई, इश्यू मजीद खराब हो गया, पहले खराब था और खराब हो गया, तो फंस गए आप। फिर क्या करो? अब क्या करो? अच्छा भाई अब एक काम करो, सऊदीया से लोन लो, चाइना से लोन ले लो, टर्की से लोन ले लो, एशियन डेवलपमेंट बैंक से लोन ले लो, फंसे हुए आप। तो बच्चे जब टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड को आंसर करें तो इस जहन में रखें, इस माइंडसेट से आंसर करें कि इकोनॉमिस्ट और पॉलिसी मेकर के लिए टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड का जानना क्यों जरूरी है, और एग्जामिनर भी यही माइंडसेट डेवलप करवाना चाहता है आपसे कि भाई टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड का डिटोरिएशन क्या इंपैक्ट ला सकता है किसी भी कंट्री। तो ये जितने भी हमने आज चार डिसएडवांटेजेस पढ़े हैं टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड के डिटोरिएशन के, कि टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड का डिटोरिएशन किस तरीके से किसी भी कंट्री के लिए हार्मफुल हो सकता है। पहला हमने पढ़ा कि उससे आपका इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ स्लो डाउन हो जाएगी, जिससे जीडीपी गिरेगी, क्योंकि एक्सपोर्ट रेवेन्यूज गिर रहे होंगे, क्योंकि आप तो प्राइमरी कमोडिटी पे डिपेंडेंट है। हमने कहा इस चक्कर में जो है वो कंट्रीज जो हैं वो ज्यादा एक्सपोर्ट करेंगे प्राइमरी कमोडिटी से, प्राइस मजीद गिर जाएगी, मजीद आप फंस जाएंगे। फिर हमने कहा गवर्नमेंट की बजट पोजीशन वर्सन हो जाएगी। फिर हमने कहा कि गवर्नमेंट की कंट्री की डेट बढ़ जाएगी। तो हमने ये चार चीजें डिस्कस की थी, तो ये चारों हमको पता होनी चाहिए कि डेवलपिंग नेशंस के लिए कितनी बड़ी प्रॉब्लम आ सकती है अगर उनके टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड वर्सन हो जाए। एंड देन पॉलिसी मेकर्स मस्ट प्लान अहेड, they must plan to ensure कि भाई if the terms of trade are worsening this year, what course of action are they supposed to take? They can't rely on debt all the time. They need to set up industries, maybe come up with supply side policies, or reduce the dependence on the export of primary commodities, reduce the dependence on your agricultural sector, set up industries then, attract labor, attract skilled labor in your country. ठीक है, अट्रैक्ट स्किल्ड लेबर, improve education in your country, improve productivity of labor in your country, improve healthcare, work on infrastructure. ये करेंगे तो आपकी इकोनॉमी में लॉन्ग टर्म कंपेटिटिवनेस डेवलप होना शुरू होगी। फिर वरना तो डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज विल रिमेन पुअर, विल रिमेन पुअर, पॉवर्टी साइकिल, दे आर ऑलवेज इन डेट, दे विल ऑलवेज रिमेन इन डेट ट्रैप, डेट साइकिल में फंसे हैं। तो एग्जाम में सवाल आएगा, अगर टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड पे क्वेश्चन आता है कि डिस्कस वेदर द वर्सनिंग ऑफ टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड इज हार्मफुल फॉर अ कंट्री, तो आपको वहां पे बताना पड़ेगा कि टर्म्स ऑफ ट्रेड का डिटोरिएशन किस तरह किसी कंट्री के लिए बैड इंपैक्ट ला सकता है। ओके गाइस, सो वी आर डन। ओके, ठीक है, थैंक यू, हाफिज।